Hey you guys, welcome back to See Meaty Mom and welcome back to my kitchen. Today I wanted to share with you 3 meals that I fed my family this week and talk with you about what healthy eating means to me and how I managed to navigate that for myself while feeding young kids as well. So stay tuned. All right, you guys, it's the first of the year and I know a lot of people are trying to eat differently. Maybe they are just trying to get back to normal after all of the holiday indulgences, or maybe they're going on a special diet or nutrition program or plan. We are not going on a diet in this household, but I am kind of just trying to get back to what normal looks like for us. When I was working WW, I used to get this question all the time. Do your kids eat what you eat? Do you make separate meals for your family than for yourself? No, I don't typically cook multiple meals at dinner time. I do not have the time to do that. I have found a way to feed myself the way that I wanted to eat while also feeding my family, but remembering that they're kids and that they have kids' palates, that they are not on a diet, that they are not on any form of restriction. I don't want them to be. And so trying to kind of marry those two concepts together could be challenging. But I thought that I would share with you 3 meals that I made for my family this week because each one of them kind of illustrates one of my strategies for making that work. Whenever I want to eat a certain way, but I also want to feed my family the same meals that I'm eating, but I don't want to feed them diet food. I'm going to jump into this video and I'll show you these meals that I made and I'll kind of talk you through my thinking as to why I'm making them certain ways, how I feel about substitutions, how I make it friendly to my kids' palates, and so on and so forth. Here we go. The first recipe that I'm going to show you guys is this Swedish meatball orzo, which I have made before. It's a family favorite recipe that everybody really likes, so I will leave the original recipe linked in the description box below. But I do make some changes and adjustments to this, so I thought it would be a great way to talk about substitutions and how I substitute different ingredients and change recipes up in a very careful way so as not to completely compromise the flavor of the dish whenever I'm trying to make it meet my own personal health standards, but also feed my family at the same time. So this recipe starts the way a lot of my recipes begin, where I am browning the ground meat and along with some chopped onions and garlic. And onions and garlic are a super cheap, healthy way to add lots of flavor to your food. Now, this recipe calls for 1.5 pounds of ground beef, and I am actually using just 1 pound of ground turkey. It is not a super lean ground turkey, it's just a regular ground turkey because I have learned that my family does not care for the super lean ground meats. So I prefer just to use less of whatever the full fat or, just the kind of medium level fat meats go. I just use a little bit less of it. So I've got 1 pound of ground turkey in there, browning with my onions and garlic. And then one of the other substitutions I'm going to make for this is whole wheat orzo. It calls for regular orzo. I can find whole wheat orzo at Sprouts and I typically keep that in my pantry. I still have some even though I haven't been to Sprouts in a while. So I'm going to be using whole wheat orzo 1 for 1. I don't reduce it. It calls for a cup. I still use a cup. So I'm using whole wheat orzo. I'm using ground turkey. I'm just using less of it. Those are some of the changes that I have made so far. This recipe also eventually calls for broth. I think it calls for beef broth. I don't buy broth anymore because it's such a pain to have to purchase it, carry it home from the store, and store it in big cartons. So I just buy broth base or better than bouillon, and I just make my broth for my dishes. So you're going to see me just add broth base and water. I did reduce the seasonings just a little bit. It called for some salt, so I used a little bit less salt than it called for. It calls for some onion powder and some garlic salt, and I used just salt and pepper to taste and a little bit of onion powder. I left the garlic salt out since I was using regular minced garlic in that, and everybody else can season it according to their taste. If we need to add a little bit of extra salt to mine or to my kids, that's fine. My husband tries to watch his salt intake. So after that, I added the water that it calls for, about 3.5 cups, and I had my broth base in there, and then I just brought it to a boil and reduced the heat and covered it and let it simmer for a while. And this turns out great, but you do want to check on it every once in a while and just make sure that it has enough water. I find that whenever you're doing these one pot dishes, especially when you're using whole wheat pasta, be careful not to turn it up too high. You don't want it to scorch, and also maybe just check on it partway through the cooking time as it's cooking and make sure it still has enough moisture. Sometimes I have to come back and add a little more water so that it doesn't burn to the bottom before it is done cooking. Now I'm going to show you the final ingredient that I stir in at the end, and I want you to tell me what you think this is. Of course, it looks like sour cream, and if you're thinking about Swedish meatball orzo or like a stroganoff style dish, you're probably thinking sour cream. But this is in fact Greek yogurt, and that is a substitution that I started to make a few years back whenever I was doing Weight Watchers. It took me a while to jump onto the Greek yogurt in place of sour cream bandwagon, but I gotta tell you, I'm so glad that I did. My family cannot tell the difference, especially whenever I am using this in a dish like this where it's going into a casserole. But I've even used this like on top of nachos, and when I'm making tacos, I've used this stirring it into soups and things like that whenever it calls for sour cream. Of course, this is plain Greek yogurt. Don't be putting vanilla yogurt in your savory dishes, y'all. And I actually prefer to use the whole milk fat Greek yogurt, because even when you compare the whole milk fat Greek yogurt to full fat sour cream, it still has less fat and more protein than the sour cream does. And so I prefer to use that instead of trying to sub low fat or fat-free sour cream. We do not care for that. I don't really want to make that substitution, so I use the Greek yogurt instead, and as I said, my family really can't tell the difference. So this was our plate tonight. This was actually one of the kids' plates because I add a piece of toast to their plate, and if I want to cut back on bread, I can do that, but this is always a winner in our household, and I'm careful about the substitutions. The next recipe I'm sharing with you is a Mediterranean roasted vegetable pasta. It is from the website sprinklesandsprouts.com, and I will be sure to leave that link in the description box for you. And this is a great example of how I make one small easy swap on my kids' plates to make this just a little bit more kid-friendly when it's a meal that my husband and I want to eat. So it calls for some chopped bell peppers and zucchinis. I always just buy the little bags of bell peppers, it seems like lately, because it seems like they're just a better price, you know, per ounce, per pound, than buying the whole bell peppers. So I have about like 2/3 of a bag of bell peppers here that I'm chopping up, and I'm going to go ahead and slice them down the center and then chop them into little pieces. And I also have a zucchini that I'm going to slice up, and I did have some squash, like half of a little yellow squash in my crisper that I needed to use up, so I'm going to throw that in there too, even though it doesn't really go, even though it's not called for in the original recipe. I feel like this is a great recipe for just using up whatever veggies you have to make just a really easy, you know, pretty healthy pasta dish. And also, this dish would be, I think it would be plant-based if you just leave out the Parmesan cheese. So there's an idea for you too if you are trying to eat plant-based. So I'm just chopping up my veggies. I'm going to put them on my sheet pan, and then I just drizzled them with some olive oil, sprinkled some salt and pepper, and I'm going to use my hands just to mix those around a little bit and make sure that they're coated in the salt and pepper and olive oil. I'm going to pop those into a 450-degree oven. Next time, I would probably bump that down to 425 or even 400 because I feel like the oven was a tad hot, but that's what this recipe called for, so that's what I did. And I do feel like this is a recipe that wants the vegetables to be like softer and not crispy, since they're going to go in a pasta dish. So I'm going to pop those into the oven. And while they're in the oven, I'm going to make the dressing that it calls for, or the sauce if you want to say as much. And it's just olive oil, a little bit of Italian seasoning, which is already in there, some minced garlic, freshly grated Parmesan cheese, which you see right there on the counter next to my little measuring cup. And it also calls for some of the water, the starchy water that you cook your pasta in. So I didn't get a shot of that, but I have already cooked my pasta and drained it, and I reserved a little bit of the pasta water, and I ended up putting about 1/3 of a cup of it into this sauce. So Italian seasoning, olive oil, salt and pepper to taste, Parmesan cheese, some starchy water, just give that a little mix, some minced garlic as well. And this made just a really simple, flavorful sauce from stuff that I already had on hand. And like I said, if you want to leave out the Parmesan cheese, I think that would make this a plant-based meal. So my vegetables are done roasting. I took them out of the oven and just kind of gave them a little bit of a stir. And I'm going to add those to my pasta right in the pot. I went ahead and, put my pasta that I had cooked and drained back into the pot that I had cooked the pasta in. I added the roasted vegetables, and then I'm just pouring the sauce that I made over the top of them, and I will use some tongs just to, combine that, stir it up completely. And I know if you have kids, you might be thinking, Mindy, this looks really good, but I'm not sure that my kids would ever eat this. I mean, there's a lot of textures, it's a lot of flavors. Kids have a very sensitive palate. I totally understand that. And my older daughter did eat this. She liked it. Like I said, my husband and I really liked it. But behind this pot, I have some just jar pasta sauce simmering. I pretty much always have a jar of this in the pantry or one that's already open in the refrigerator. So it's really easy for me just to heat some up. And before I threw the pasta dish together, I pulled out some of the spaghetti and put it onto the little kids' plates, and I just topped it with the jar marinara sauce and a little bit of Parmesan cheese, and I served their vegetables on the side. So it's almost like just a deconstructed meal with a different sauce that is more palatable to them. So that really didn't require very much more work for me. But here it is, the finished product. It was really delicious. I will definitely make this again. And as I said, my husband really enjoyed this dish, and it was a great way to use up some vegetables that we had on hand in the refrigerator. The last recipe that I'm sharing with you is my dad's taco soup, which I know I have made several times before. It is a tried and true staple in this household. I will leave the recipe linked in the description box below. But I wanted to talk about this recipe because I think it is fabulous for sneaking in some high fiber foods like beans and vegetables. And this taco soup recipe in particular does not call for any cream or any cream cheese or any cheese in the soup itself. You can add those things to your own bowl later, which can come in handy if you've got people in your house that are eating different ways, but the soup doesn't call for those things. So it's got 2 cans of beans, navy beans and great northern beans. I have used different kinds of beans in this. I do like this combination. It calls for a can of tomatoes. I like to use the ones that have green chilies in them just to add a little more flavor. 2 different kinds of corn, hominy and shoe peg corn. I have used regular corn instead of shoe peg corn before, or even frozen corn, that's fine. It calls for a carton of broth of your choice. I don't use broth anymore. I just use 4 cups of water and then some better than bouillon or some broth base. And it calls for 1 packet of taco seasoning and 1 packet of ranch seasoning. But I make mine homemade. I will leave that video linked in the description box below. And it also calls for a pound of ground meat, which I cut back to just half a pound because, like I said, I like to use just the regular full fat or medium fat and not go super lean on the meat because I want it to add flavor to the dish. You could leave it out if you wanted to. I've made it without the meat before. So I've got all my ingredients in the crock pot, and I'm just going to add 4 cups of water to that, and I'm going to let it simmer on low. Everything's already cooked because my ground meat is already cooked. So really I'm just letting this simmer to kind of let the flavors come together. I added 2 tablespoons of my homemade ranch mix and 2 tablespoons of my taco seasoning, by the way, in place of the packets that it calls for. And my dad actually makes this on the stove. He just stirs it all together. He browns the meat, adds the cans, adds the broth and the seasoning, stirs it all together, and he just lets it simmer for a couple hours. I just find it's easiest to put it in my crock pot, let it simmer on low for 3 to 4 hours. It is ready to go. And it is always a hit. And like I said, even though my kids would not eat beans on the side, they eat beans in this soup. And they can add some chips to it. They can add stir in some plain Greek yogurt. They can stir in some cheese. It's sort of up to you. I just add a couple of tortilla chips and just a little sprinkling of cheese to mine. You could, of course, leave those out if you're trying to avoid those things. But again, it's such a great, versatile meal, and there's so much fiber and so many nutrients from all those beans and the corn and the tomatoes in this. So it may not look healthy at first, but when you really dive into the ingredients, this definitely fits the bill for me and how I'm trying to feed myself and my family. So there you have it, you guys, 3 meals that I feed my family and the strategies and tricks that I use to feed them while also sticking to my own nutritional goals. I hope that gives you guys some ideas, and I will be sure to check in with another video very soon. Bye.